Anna's wagon creaked across the dry, red earth, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows over the land. Dust rose in clouds behind her, swirling like sparks before a fire. She had traveled miles, and though her body was weary, her eyes burned with something fierce, a fire that no distance could dull. Her dress was plain, the hem singed from weeks of hard travel, but it was the fire in her eyes that held attention. She was plain in some ways, but not in the ways that mattered. Anna wasn't here for a welcome, and she certainly wasn't looking for sympathy. She had a job to do, and she would do it well. Mariel stood by the porch, a quiet figure in the fading light. At 34, he'd seen his share of hardship, the scars on his hands and jaw speaking more than his weathered face ever could. He watched the wagon approach, the town already whispering. They'd warned him. She's out of temper, too much fire, they'd said. Twice turned away. Can't keep her under a roof for long. But Mariel didn't believe that. He knew that some tempers were born of things deeper than what people care to understand. He believed everyone deserved a second chance. Anna's wagon ground to a halt with a jarring squeal of wood, and the first thing she did was climb down, boots striking the red dust like a match flicked to life. Without a word, she adjusted her skirts and walked past him, her movements sharp but purposeful. The air around her was thick with dust, yet it seemed strangely awake, alive in a way that made Mariel's chest tighten, a knot forming there. She didn't look at him, didn't pause to speak, but he could feel her presence like a storm gathering on the horizon. "Where's the kitchen?" Anna's voice cut through the stillness of the moment, sharp and practical. There was no time for pleasantries. Mariel blinked, caught off guard by the directness. Straight through the door, just past the hall. She nodded briefly and swept past him, skirts brushing against his boots. He stood there for a moment, watching her go, the smell of soap and ash following in her wake, mingling in the hot summer air. The simple gesture, her dismissive air, struck him with an odd familiarity. She wasn't here for friendship, and that suited him just fine. He had hired her to cook, not to make friends. But something about the way she moved, the way she kept her distance from him and from everything else, intrigued him. He wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was her stubbornness, or maybe it was the way she carried her pain in silence, her fierce precision making her more an enigma than a person. Over the next week, Anna's routine unfolded with relentless regularity. She was up before dawn every day, building fires and baking biscuits with an efficiency that bordered on the obsessive. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion, just work. The ranch needed that, and so did Mariel. He watched her, as much as he could without her noticing, and he saw the way she moved with a kind of fury that kept others at arm's length. He recognized it. It was the same fury that lived within him, one born from wounds too deep to talk about. She never complained. She never faltered. But he saw the exhaustion behind her sharp eyes, the weariness in her stiff movements. He was no stranger to that kind of fight. He understood that some people didn't speak of their wounds, didn't let anyone see their cracks, but they bled anyway, quietly. He began to leave small signs of his own care, silent gestures to ease the load. A water cup by his saddle when he knew she'd be working in the kitchen, a door hinge mended before it could squeak. Neither of them said anything, but both of them noticed. The house was a little quieter now, and it wasn't just because Anna had settled in. It was because there was something about her that mirrored him, something that drew them together without either of them understanding why. One morning, Anna didn't meet his eyes at breakfast. She had a hand to her mouth, chewing quickly but distracted. When their gazes briefly met, she turned away, as if ashamed of something unspoken. Mariel's own scars weren't something he liked to talk about, and he knew she carried some of her own. It wasn't the first time they had shared that silent recognition. Two wounded souls standing in the same room, neither of them willing to be the first to speak of the hurt. But gossip traveled faster than horses in a small town. And soon, Anna's reputation, her fierceness, her bluntness, Her refusal to conform was the talk of the town. As the days passed, Mariel noticed the tension in Anna's back whenever she stepped into town, the way she walked just a little bit faster when women in the market stared too long. In the quiet of the evening, when the ranch settled and the world outside was still, Anna sat on the porch steps, her eyes lost in the distance. Mariel stood nearby, pretending not to watch, though his gaze lingered just a little longer than it should have. And that night, as the wind picked up and the smell of rain mixed with the dust in the air, the first storm of their lives was just beginning to brew. But that was still to come. For now, the ranch was still, and so were they. The unspoken question hovered between them, one that neither was ready to answer. The town had a way of speaking, especially when it came to someone like Anna. The whispers followed her like a shadow, settling over her with every passing day. By the third week, as Anna made her usual stop at the general store, she could hear it plainly, the voices of the women behind the counter, voices that carried the sharp edge of judgment. "She's too bold." One of them muttered, "She doesn't know when to be quiet. He'll regret bringing that fire under his roof." Anna's cheeks flushed, but she bit down on her tongue, unwilling to let their words burn through her. She had heard worse in the past, from people who had never understood her, from people who saw only the fury in her eyes and not the pain that fueled it. As she slammed the door of the store with more force than necessary, the heat of their words clung to her like a suffocating blanket, but she kept walking. Pride and humiliation mixed in her chest, and though she tried to dismiss the sting, it lingered, bitter and heavy. Back at the ranch, she entered the kitchen with her usual briskness, slamming the door a little harder than she meant to. Mariel, who had been sitting on the porch, saw her fury in the set of her shoulders. He said nothing, only watched as she moved through her routine, her every step filled with a kind of sharp, controlled anger. She didn't speak to him directly, but he knew. She carried it all inside her, the weight of the world, of a past she didn't share, of the rumors that followed her. The next morning, as they worked side by side, the silence between them grew thicker. The tension had changed, though neither of them acknowledged it. Anna was no longer the defiant woman she had been when she arrived. She was quieter now, her movements more deliberate, her gaze always slightly averted. And Mariel, for his part, grew accustomed to her silences, to the way she avoided his eyes when he passed her a simple gesture, a glass of water, a piece of bread. They had settled into an uneasy rhythm, neither of them talking, neither of them getting too close. But it was in those silences that something shifted. One evening, when Mariel was polishing his bridle, something unexpected happened. As the day turned to dusk, Anna stood on the porch, her eyes distant, her arms crossed. Mariel noticed the change in her posture, the way she was trying to keep herself together, to hold back whatever storm was brewing inside her. He wondered what it was that kept her so tightly wound. It wasn't his place to ask, but he found himself doing so anyway, his voice breaking the quiet. "You all right?" he asked, his tone softer than usual. Anna froze, then looked up at him, her eyes sharp. "I don't like people with small tongues and large opinions," she replied, her voice low, like she was testing him, like she was daring him to challenge her. Mariel almost smiled at the boldness of her response, the fierceness in her words. But instead, he crossed his arms and regarded her silently for a moment. "They'll find someone else to talk about," he said, his tone matter of fact. Anna didn't reply at first, but the anger in her eyes softened. She was about to turn away when he stopped her with a simple, quiet question. "Can you?" The challenge was unexpected, and it made her stop. Her temper flared at first, but beneath that, something else, something quieter, made her pause. She turned to him, her voice tight with emotion, though she tried to mask it. "I don't need a man to tell me when to speak." Mariel's arms remained crossed, but his stance softened. "Then don't. Just do it well," he said, his words slow and steady. The tension in the air hung between them. neither of them willing to break it just yet. But in that moment, something had shifted. Anna looked away, the weight of his words settling deep inside her. The night grew quieter after that conversation, the cicadas buzzing softly in the background, their song the only sound between them. As the hours passed, Anna lay in bed, her hands trembling at her sides. She wondered if she had said too much, if she had shown him too much of herself. She had always fought to keep her walls high, to guard against the world and its expectations. But with Mariel, she couldn't help but feel a strange pull, a curiosity that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She had spent her whole life running from people's judgments, from the assumption that she was too much, too fierce to be kept. And yet here she was still standing, still fighting not only the world but her own fears. Meanwhile, Mariel sat on the porch, his thoughts darkened by his own past, by the scars that marked his body and his soul. He hadn't meant to say what he had that night in the barn, the words he'd spoken without thinking. "I'll never marry a woman like that," he had muttered, words meant for no one but himself. He hadn't known Anna was there, hadn't known that she had heard every word, every doubt he had thrown into the night. He had thought his words would stay in the dark, but they hadn't. And now, the weight of them was crushing him. He hadn't meant it, not really. But Anna's silence, her avoidance, made him wonder. Had she heard him? Had she believed him? That night, as the house settled into silence and the night air cooled, Mariel's thoughts turned inward. He felt the heaviness of what he had said, the way it had unintentionally cut through the fragile bond they had begun to build. He knew he had made a mistake, but he wasn't sure how to fix it. And in the midst of it all, there was Anna, a woman who had lived a life full of more pain and loss than he could ever understand. Yet she had managed to stand tall through it all. He admired her for that. But somewhere deep inside, he knew that admiration could only take them so far. There were words they both needed to say, words that might heal or words that might destroy them. As the sun set, casting the world in the dusky light of evening, Anna stood by the window, her hands steadying herself against the frame. And as she did, she caught sight of Mariel working in the distance. Something in her chest twisted, anger, sorrow, longing, so many things that she had never allowed herself to feel. But it was the silence that spoke the loudest. They were both trapped in it, prisoners of their own making, and neither of them was quite sure how to escape it. It wasn't until the next morning, when the sun rose high, that the storm inside both of them began to grow. The mornings came earlier after that night, maybe because Anna could no longer sleep, or maybe because the weight of her thoughts had become too much to bear. The morning after the confrontation was the first of many that Anna couldn't escape. She rose before dawn, just as she had every day, but today it was different. Her movements were sharp, as if every action was fueled by a restless energy that she couldn't quiet. The bread dough she kneaded felt heavier, the heat of the fire in the hearth more oppressive. Each movement, each task was an attempt to escape the thoughts that crowded her mind, the words that Mariel had unwittingly left behind. No peace in her, just sparks and fury. The memory of those words echoed in her head, sharp as glass. He didn't mean them. She knew that, but the sting was still there. The words had found their mark. So, she worked, pushing herself harder than usual, as if the physical strain could drown out the voice in her head. But it didn't. All it did was make her more aware of the anger that swirled inside her, coiled tight and waiting to burst. She knew Mariel was watching. She could feel his gaze on her, even when she refused to acknowledge it. He was patient, letting her carry the weight of her silence, understanding without words the battle that raged within her. But she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep that silence. Later that day, a stranger arrived at the ranch. He was a traveler, tall and lean, with a friendly smile and a red kerchief tied loosely around his neck. He was a familiar face to Mariel, a friend from town. They spoke in the shade of the porch, their voices easy, carrying the light camaraderie of two men who had known each other for years. Anna, working inside, could hear their conversation through the open window, the occasional laugh from Mariel, the easy banter that always came when someone visited. But when the traveler's gaze shifted to her, she felt it, his eyes lingering just a little too long. She kept her back to them, pretending not to notice, though the sensation of being watched made her skin prickle. "That your new cook?" the traveler asked, his tone light, teasing. "Pretty thing, but looks like she bites." Mariel's jaw tightened at the words, and Anna heard the sharpness in his reply. "She's been through more than most. Leave her be." Anna's heart skipped a beat at the defense in his voice, and though she didn't turn to look at him, something inside her shifted. No man had ever stood up for her like that, not without wanting something in return. The words hung in the air, something more meaningful than she could fully grasp. The conversation continued, but Anna's thoughts were no longer on the weather or the man in the kitchen. Her mind raced, tangled with thoughts she didn't know how to untangle. She had been here for weeks now, working side by side with Mariel, and yet she still couldn't figure him out. He was quiet, patient, and steady, everything she wasn't, and he had defended her. Just like that. No questions, no expectations. Later that evening, as she placed a fresh batch of biscuits on the table, she left an extra one by his plate. It wasn't much, but it was something. He didn't acknowledge it, not with words, but when he took the biscuit, he gave her a small nod of thanks, his gaze meeting hers for a fraction of a second. It was brief, but it was enough. For the first time since she'd arrived, the air between them felt different, less like a storm waiting to break, and more like the calm after a thunderclap. The next day, a dust storm rolled in from the south, dark and menacing, swallowing the horizon in a bruise of purple and gray. Mariel was already out, working to gather the cattle in before the storm hit. Anna watched from the porch, her gaze drawn to the sky, the air thick with heat and the scent of dust. It wasn't the kind of storm that you could predict, not with the certainty of the thunderstorms back east. This one was different, wild and unpredictable like the land itself. As the first gust of wind hit, carrying sand and dirt, Mariel's movements grew more urgent. Anna's heart quickened, but she didn't think. She ran for the barn, the wind tearing at her skirts, the dust stinging her face. Inside, chaos greeted her. Horses were panicked, kicking and thrashing against their stalls, the sound of hooves scraping against wood loud and frantic. Mariel was already there, half blind from the dust, struggling to control the frightened mare that had worked herself into a frenzy. Without thinking, Anna grabbed the halter rope from the wall and moved toward the animal. "You'll spook her more if you pull that hard," she shouted, her voice carrying over the howl of the wind. Mariel turned, eyes narrowed, breathing ragged as he assessed her. She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. They didn't need words. Together, they worked to calm the mare, coaxing her into a stall, closing the door just as lightning cracked through the sky, splitting the air with the sound that made the ground shake. The storm was close now, and the wind was deafening. Just as they finished securing the animals, a loose plank from the barn's roof came crashing down. Mariel dove to shield the horse, his arm raised instinctively. The impact was enough to knock him off balance, and in a blur, Anna was there, grabbing his collar, pulling him toward the nearest shelter. She wasn't strong enough to move him easily, but adrenaline powered her, and together they stumbled out of the barn, half blind from the dust and smoke, only to collapse in the dirt as the barn behind them gave way with a deafening roar. The flames quickly engulfed the building, their heat rising and mixing with the dust, turning the night into a furnace. They lay there, breathing heavily, their bodies bruised but alive. Mariel looked at her, his shirt singed, his hands covered in soot. The fire had taken the barn, but it had left them standing. Anna, still trembling from the ordeal, stood first. She wiped the dirt and ash from her skirt, her voice low but steady. "You'd have lost your best mare if I hadn't seen her running loose," she said. her hands still shaking as she steadied herself. Mariel met her gaze, his gray eyes clear, unspoken understanding passing between them. "You were right," he replied simply, and in that moment, the walls between them crumbled, if only for a second. They had survived the storm together, and though the world around them was torn apart, something between them had changed. The air, once heavy with tension, now felt lighter, as if a new understanding had begun to take root between them, fragile but real. As the last of the dust settled and the sound of the fire began to die down, the silence between them spoke louder than any words could. Anna had given him something that night, something more than courage. She had given him a glimpse of who she was, not the fierce, untamable woman everyone else saw, but the one who could run into the flames without a second thought. And in that moment, Mariel saw her, not as the woman with the fire, but as the one who had learned to fight, to survive, and to protect. For the first time since their first meeting, the storm between them began to pass. And with it, the first fragile thread of connection was formed. The days following the fire were quiet, the silence between Anna and Mariel more palpable than before. The ranch had been reduced to embers, but in the aftermath of the storm and the blaze, something shifted between them. There were no words spoken to explain it, no gestures made to acknowledge the change. But the air between them felt different, more delicate, like the fragile moments after a storm has passed, when the world seems to hold its breath before life begins again. Anna moved slower now, her gaze no longer darting away when Mariel entered the room, though she still kept her distance. She had become quieter, not withdrawn, but somehow gentler, as if the fire that had driven her for so long had burned away something sharp inside her. And Mariel noticed. He watched her with a quiet sort of patience, waiting for the wall she had built around herself to crumble even more, though he didn't press. He didn't need to. There were small moments, moments of tenderness that neither of them had expected. One evening, he sat at the table a little longer than usual, his thoughts still on the aftermath of the fire, his fingers tapping absent-mindedly on the wood. Anna was washing dishes, the soft sound of water filling the silence between them. As she passed him, her hand brushed against his, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to hold still. Neither of them pulled away. It was a simple touch, an accidental meeting of skin, but it lingered longer than either had anticipated. Anna didn't look at him, didn't speak, but the brush of their hands held 1,000 unspoken words. Mariel couldn't help but notice the way her shoulders had softened since the fire, the way her movements, though still precise, had become more fluid, less driven by the need to keep the world at bay. She wasn't the same woman who had arrived, furious and untamable, with a heart that had learned to shut out the world. This Anna was different, and though Mariel couldn't put it into words, he felt it, a quiet understanding between them that neither of them could explain. That night, Anna hummed softly as she washed the dishes, her voice a low, sad tune that made Mariel pause. He hadn't heard her sing before, not like this. It wasn't a song of joy, but of something deeper, of memory of loss. He leaned back in his chair, the soft cadence of her song stirring something inside him that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. There was a loneliness in her voice that he recognized, the kind that came from years of being alone in a world that never understood you. He wanted to ask her about it, about the song, about the pain that lingered just beneath the surface. But instead, he stayed silent, listening to the melody that seemed to fill the space between them. The next morning, a simple accident shattered the quiet. Mariel had been sharpening a knife near the water trough when the blade slipped, cutting across his palm. The wound wasn't deep, but it bled freely, dark red staining the rough skin of his hand. He cursed softly, reaching for a rag, but before he could tend to it, Anna appeared, her face tight with concern. "Let me see," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Mariel hesitated for a moment. but he knew it was pointless to argue with her. She was already kneeling beside him, her small, calloused hands gently pressing the rag against the wound. She didn't flinch at the sight of blood. There was no hesitation, no judgment, just quiet care. For a moment, Mariel forgot to breathe. Her hands, warm and steady, held his in a way that made something inside him tighten. He hadn't realized how much he needed someone else's touch, how much he needed to feel that care, until this moment. "You ought to be more careful," Anna said, her voice quiet but firm as she wrapped the rag around his palm. "Can't mend fence with one good hand." He gave a wry smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You fuss worse than my old foreman." She met his gaze briefly, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of humor in her eyes. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by something else, something more guarded. She finished tying the bandage and stood up, brushing the dirt from her knees. "I used to patch wounds like this before," she said, her voice suddenly small, quiet. Mariel watched her closely, his heart picking up its pace. She was talking about her past again, about the things she'd never shared. "When I worked for the Harpers," she continued, her voice steady despite the tremor in her words. "Lady of the house, her husband liked to throw things when he drank." Mariel's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't known. He hadn't known that much of Anna's life had been lived in the shadow of that kind of violence. He swallowed, struggling to find words, but none came. She didn't look at him, her eyes focused on the bandage she had tied, her fingers working to adjust it, though it didn't need it. She never learned to hold a knife right after that, Anna added quietly, as if the memory still haunted her. "That's why you left?" Mariel asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Anna nodded once, her eyes downcast. "That's why I ran." There was no anger in her voice, no bitterness, just a flat, resigned tone. Mariel watched her for a long time, his mind racing with the weight of her words. The pain she had carried, the scar she had kept hidden. He wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but he knew better. Instead, he simply said, "You did the right thing." Anna's gaze flickered to his for a moment, her green eyes sharp. "Did I?" she asked, her voice thick with something that wasn't quite sorrow. "Folks still look at me like I'm trouble, like I deserve it." He shook his head slowly. "They're wrong." Her lips twisted in a humorless smile. "That's what kind men say when they want to sound good." He didn't say anything to that. There was nothing he could say, not when the truth of her words hung in the air between them. But in that silence, something shifted again. There were no more walls between them, no more secrets. Anna had shared something with him, something that had once seemed too heavy to carry. And in return, Mariel had offered something he rarely gave, his unspoken trust. They were standing on the edge of something new, something fragile, and neither of them knew what would happen next. But for the first time, it didn't seem so impossible. The shift between Anna and Mariel was subtle at first, barely noticeable, like the softest breeze before a storm. But that change, no matter how quiet, didn't go unnoticed by the people around them. Gossip, like the relentless wind on the prairie, had a way of creeping into every corner of small town. It had always been this way. And so, when Mariel walked into the feed store one morning, he wasn't surprised to hear it, though it still struck him with a quiet fury. Two ranchers were talking just outside, their voices rising in crude laughter as they exchanged their latest thoughts on Anna. "She's got that cook living under his roof now," one of them said with a low chuckle. "Wild one, that woman. Maybe she's not just cooking his meals." His companion's laughter followed. Wouldn't blame him. Man's got his needs. Mariel's jaw tightened, the bag of oats in his hands suddenly feeling like it weighed 100 pounds. He didn't confront them. Not here, not now. But the words were like a brand on his skin, leaving him raw and unsettled. He didn't reply, only turned and left the store, his hands clenched around the sack, his mind whirling. As he walked back to the ranch, his thoughts darkened, the quiet shame of those words weighing on him like a storm cloud. When he returned home, Anna saw it immediately. She could always read him, even without him speaking. "Something wrong?" she asked, her voice sharp with the edge of concern. He shook his head, the words lodged in his throat. He didn't want to bring the gossip to her. He didn't want to show her how deeply it cut. "Nothing worth repeating," he said, but she didn't believe him. She didn't need to. The tension between them thickened as they moved through the day, and Anna, for the first time since arriving, found herself watching him closely, sensing the shift in him, the quiet, angry resolve that simmered beneath the surface. "It's about me, isn't it?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence between them. The question wasn't angry, just direct. Mariel hesitated. He didn't want to tell her what the men had said, didn't want to make her feel the weight of their judgment. But it mattered. It mattered to him, and he knew he had to say something. "Doesn't matter what they say," he muttered. "I've heard worse." She tilted her head, studying him with those sharp green eyes. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked, the question softer now, more vulnerable than it had been before. He didn't answer her right away. He couldn't. The words he wanted to say wouldn't come. Instead, he just looked at her, his gaze lingering on the strength in her shoulders, the quiet pain behind her eyes, and he knew the answer. It mattered because he cared more than he was willing to admit. It mattered because, for the first time in a long time, he didn't want to see her hurt. But he couldn't say that. So, he said nothing, the weight of his unspoken thoughts heavy in the air between them. The day dragged on, and evening came without resolution. Anna, still trying to make sense of Mariel's silence, found herself stepping out onto the porch later that night, her thoughts tangled. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but she hadn't expected the quiet tenderness that had crept into their lives. After everything, after the fire, after the words that had been spoken, the weight between them should have been unbearable, but it wasn't. And yet, there was still something unspoken between them. She found Mariel sitting on the steps of the porch, his bandaged hand resting on his knee, the tin cup of coffee in his other hand long gone cold. He hadn't noticed her at first, his eyes lost in the darkening sky. Anna hesitated for a moment before she took a step closer, her boots soft on the wooden porch. "You shouldn't have to defend me," she said quietly, breaking the silence between them. Mariel's gaze shifted to her, and he gave a small shake of his head. "You didn't deserve what they said," he replied softly, his voice rough, as if the words had cost him something. "No," she agreed, her voice low, "but I've stopped expecting fairness from the world." She looked out toward the horizon, watching the sun dip lower, casting a pink-orange glow over the fields. "Then you shouldn't have to stop expecting kindness," he said, his voice gentle but firm, as if he meant every word. Anna didn't answer him at first. The words hung between them like a promise, a truth she didn't know how to believe. She wasn't used to kindness, not from men, not from anyone. Her life had been shaped by survival, by the need to fight for every scrap of peace, and the idea that anyone, least of all Mariel, would offer her kindness was a notion she had long buried. But his words cracked something open inside her, a softening she wasn't prepared for. She looked down at her feet for a moment, taking in the stillness of the night, and then, without meaning to, she laughed softly, a breathless sound that surprised them both. "Guess I'll have to let you fuss again," she said, her tone lighter now. He smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him in days, a smile that wasn't guarded, that wasn't weighed down by unspoken things. "Guess you will," he murmured. The night settled around them, the silence between them no longer oppressive but comforting, like the quiet after a long storm. They didn't say anything more, but neither of them moved. In that moment, it felt as if something had shifted, not just between them but within them. Something old, something buried, was being unearthed, and Anna felt the faintest stir of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her wonder if there was still something more between them. Something that could be built on, something worth fighting for. That night, as the stars slowly blinked into view above, Anna didn't feel quite so alone. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The days after the quiet conversation were filled with a new kind of tension, a kind that wasn't born from anger or misunderstanding, but from something much more fragile: hope. It was the kind of hope that crept in slow, like the dawn's first light, casting a soft glow over everything it touched. Anna found herself moving with a bit more ease, her hands less clenched, her gaze no longer darting away from Mariel's when their paths crossed. There was something unspoken between them, something that hovered in the quiet spaces, but neither of them dared to name it. It was the calm before the next storm, the kind that made both of them uneasy. Anna could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her again, a familiar pressure that never fully went away. She didn't trust it, didn't trust the ease between them, the way they seemed to fall into a rhythm without thinking. She wasn't used to peace. She wasn't used to quiet. It was in those moments, in the stillness of the evening or the slow rhythm of their work, that Anna started to wonder if she was becoming someone she wasn't ready to be. She wasn't sure she knew how to be soft, to let someone else in without fear of losing herself. And Mariel, despite the tenderness between them, still held something back, still wore the weight of his own silence. The quiet grew louder with each passing day, until it reached a boiling point. It wasn't the words spoken, but the absence of them, the unsaid things that hung thick in the air, that broke them. One evening, when the wind picked up and the sky darkened with the promise of an impending storm, Mariel went out to check on the barn. The lantern had been left burning inside, its faint light casting shadows across the wooden beams. It wasn't unusual for him to check on things late, but that night, Anna noticed something in him that unsettled her: a restlessness, a tension in the way he moved. She watched from the porch, her heart beating a little faster as he disappeared into the night. The wind carried the scent of rain, but something else lingered in the air, something metallic, like the taste of a storm that was just out of reach. Anna couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. It wasn't just the weather. It was him, the way he walked away from her, as if the weight of everything they hadn't said was too much to bear. She stood there for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the barn, the lantern's light flickering in the distance. Then, the sound came, soft at first, barely noticeable over the wind. A crash. The unmistakable sound of something heavy falling, followed by a faint, distant roar. She froze. The wind shifted, and the fire's presence was unmistakable. It was no longer a flicker of light. The barn was burning. "Mariel!" she shouted, her voice lost in the roar of the wind, but she didn't wait for a response. Her legs moved before she could think, her feet pounding across the dirt as she raced toward the barn. Smoke already thick in the air, the acrid smell of burning wood and hay mixing with the dust. She could barely see through the haze, but she knew he was inside. She could feel it in her bones. He was in there, and he was in trouble. The fire had caught quickly, spreading through the dry hay and wood, a beast that could not be controlled. Anna didn't stop to think. She ran into the barn, her skirts catching on the wind, her breath coming in quick gasps as she pushed through the smoke. She could barely make out the shapes of the horses in the stalls, their panicked cries ringing in her ears. Then she saw him, Mariel, half blind from the smoke, struggling to free the last mare from her stall. His hand was bandaged, the wound from the knife still fresh, but he was still fighting, still trying to save what he could. He was so focused on the mare that he didn't see her coming. "Get back!" he shouted when he saw her, his voice hoarse and frantic. "It'll come down. Get out!" But Anna didn't listen. She couldn't. She couldn't leave him behind, couldn't let the fire take him. She grabbed the bucket of water by the door and threw it over the flames, trying to slow the spread, but it was useless. The fire roared louder, hungry for more. The heat seared her skin. The smoke made her cough, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The barn was collapsing around them. The roof groaned and cracked under the weight of the flames, the wood splintering and snapping. Mariel's face was covered in soot, his eyes wide with panic as he pulled the mare toward the door, but the beam above him was already beginning to fall. It came crashing down, the sound deafening as it tore through the roof. Anna didn't hesitate. She ran to him, pulling him out of the way just in time as the beam fell, inches from where he had been standing. He stumbled, disoriented, and Anna grabbed his collar, pulling him with all her strength. Together, they staggered through the smoke, half blind, their lungs burning with every breath. The fire roared behind them, a beast unleashed, but they kept moving, one step after another, until they finally stumbled out into the open air, collapsing in the dirt just as the barn gave way with a deafening crash. The night was silent for a moment, save for the distant crackle of the fire and the sounds of their ragged breathing. Mariel's shirt was singed, his hands blackened with soot, but they were alive. He looked at Anna, his eyes wide, and for the first time in weeks, he saw her, really saw her. He saw the fire in her, the fierce determination that had carried her through everything. He reached out, his fingers brushing against hers, the touch rough but tender. "Why would you do that?" he rasped, his voice hoarse. Anna's heart pounded in her chest as she looked at him. She had no words, not for this, not for what she had just done, not for the fear that still gripped her chest. She simply shook her head, her voice breaking as she said the only truth she could. "Because I couldn't watch you die." His expression shifted, something like understanding flickering in his eyes. She looked down at her hands, trembling, blackened with ash and soot, and the weight of the night settled over her. She hadn't thought, she hadn't planned, but she had done it. She had run into the fire to save him, to save them both. And in that moment, something changed between them. Not the fire, not the destruction around them, but something inside them both, something deep and raw and real. And for the first time, Anna realized that she hadn't just saved him, she had saved herself. The days that followed the fire felt like a slow unraveling, the world holding its breath as if the storm had not quite passed, as if the land, still smoldering with the last remnants of the blaze, was waiting for something else to happen. Anna moved through the motions of the day with a quiet determination, her body moving like it had always done, but something inside her had changed, had been shifted by the chaos, by the storm, by the fire that had brought them together in a way neither of them had expected. She worked harder than ever, keeping her mind busy, her hands occupied, trying to outrun the storm that still raged in her chest. But there was a softness to her now, a quietness that had not been there before. She no longer carried herself with the same sharpness, the same edge. She was still fierce, still strong, but the fire in her had softened, tempered by something that felt like a quiet acceptance. She had saved him. She had run into the flames to bring him out, and in doing so, she had found something within herself that she hadn't known existed. She had found a part of herself that could care without fear, that could fight for something beyond survival. And it terrified her. But in the quiet that followed the fire, in the stillness of the ranch as it began to rebuild, she found a peace that had always eluded her. Mariel, too, moved through the days with a quiet kind of strength. He watched Anna with a kind of reverence, as if seeing her for the first time, understanding her in a way he hadn't before. He saw the woman who had run into the fire to save him, who had risked everything without a second thought. And he knew, deep down, that she had done it not just for him, but for herself. There was something about her, something wild and untamed, something that had been buried beneath the weight of the world for so long. And he saw it now. The storm inside her had not broken her. It had shaped her, forged her into something stronger than anyone, including her, could have ever imagined. Mariel had his own battles to fight, his own demons to face. The fire had left its mark on him, as it had on the land, and yet he found himself feeling something he had never thought possible: hope. The storm that had been brewing inside him, the quiet rage and pain that he had carried for years, began to settle. He no longer felt the need to keep everything inside, to keep the world at arm's length. Anna had shown him that there was another way. There was strength in vulnerability, in sharing the burdens you carried with someone else. And while he had been terrified to let someone in, terrified to show his own scars, Anna had done it first. She had opened herself up in a way that was both painful and beautiful, and in doing so, she had made room for him to do the same. It was in these days, in the quiet moments when they worked side by side to rebuild the ranch, that Mariel began to see the full picture of who they were together. They were two broken people, two souls who had been scarred by the world in ways that no one could ever fully understand, and yet they had found each other. They had built something together, something that was more than just a house or a ranch. It was a home. It was a place where the wounds they had carried for so long could begin to heal, a place where they could find peace in each other's presence. The nights were the hardest, the quietest. They would sit together after supper, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, and talk, sometimes about nothing, sometimes about everything. There were no more walls between them, no more secrets they kept hidden. They had both shared their pasts, their scars, and in that sharing, they had found a kind of freedom. Anna had told him about the Harpers, about the violence she had witnessed, about the years she had spent running, trying to outrun the memories. She had told him about the nights when the world had seemed like a dark and unforgiving place, and how she had learned to keep her heart locked away, to never trust anyone, because trust had always led to pain. And Mariel had listened. He had listened with a kind of quiet understanding, not offering words of comfort, not trying to fix her, but simply being there, letting her speak, letting her heal. And in the silence that followed, Anna had found something that she hadn't even known she was looking for: acceptance. She had always thought that she needed to be strong, that she needed to keep the world at bay. But here with Mariel, she realized that there was strength in letting go, in trusting someone else with her heart. Mariel, for his part, had shared his own story. He had told her about the fire that had left its mark on him, about the way he had learned to keep his distance from people, to hide the scars on his body and his soul. He had told her about the pain he had carried, the loneliness that had followed him for years, and how he had learned to live with it. But in Anna, he had found someone who understood, someone who had been through her own fire and had come out stronger on the other side. And though he had never imagined it, he had found something in her that he had never found in himself: hope. She had shown him that it was possible to love, to let someone in without fear of losing yourself. She had shown him that it was possible to heal, to rebuild, and to find peace in the process. The rebuilding of the ranch became a metaphor for the rebuilding of their lives. Every nail, every beam, every piece of what they worked on together was a reminder that they could rebuild themselves, that they could rebuild what had been broken. It was slow work, but it was work that they did together. There were days when the memories of the fire and the pain seemed like too much to bear, but they pushed through. And with each passing day, the ranch began to take shape again, just as they did. The fire had left its mark, but it had also made room for something new to grow. The land began to heal. The trees that had been scorched by the flames started to bloom again, and the grass that had been burned to ash started to return. And in the same way, Anna and Mariel began to heal. They had been burned, broken, but they had found something in each other that made them whole. As the days passed, the town began to notice the change in them. The gossip faded, replaced by grudging respect. People could see the way the ranch was flourishing, the way it had come back to life after the fire. And while there were still whispers behind their backs, Anna and Mariel no longer cared. They had found something stronger than the opinions of others. They had found each other. Anna never became soft. She didn't lose the fire that burned within her, but now that fire had a place to rest. She remained fierce, unapologetically strong. But now there was space for tenderness, for vulnerability, and for the kind of love that didn't ask her to change. Mariel, too, remained who he was, scarred, weathered by the years, but no longer burdened by his past. Together, they built something neither of them could have built alone. The ranch became known for its hospitality, for its open doors and warm hearts. People came from miles around, seeking a second chance, and Anna and Mariel gave it to them. They had found peace, not in perfection, but in the acceptance of each other's brokenness. And in that peace, they had created a life that was theirs, something real, something unbreakable. Years later, travelers passing through would speak of them. The cook with eyes like green fire, and the rancher whose hands could gentle the wildest horse. And they would say, those two, they make sense somehow. And they did. Together, they had forged a partnership stronger than anything they could have built alone. A partnership forged in honesty, tempered by hardship, and strengthened by choice.